Millions of Catholics around the world are in mourning after the death of Pope Francis from a stroke and heart failure. He was 88. The Vatican announced that the Pope died at 7:35 this morning, less than 24 hours after he was last seen in public blessing the Easter crowds. The Pope's body is now lying in a chapel in Vatican City. His funeral would normally be held 4 to 6 days after his death, so possibly as soon as this weekend. The US President Donald Trump has already said tonight that he will be attending. Pope Francis was last seen in public just yesterday, appearing on the balcony overlooking St Peter's Square to bless thousands of worshippers who had gathered there to see him on Easter Sunday. He was the leader of more than 1 billion Catholics, and tributes have been paid from all around the world. We'll look back at his life and we'll look ahead at the next days and weeks as preparations are made for his funeral and then the election of his successor. Our first report is from Rupert Wingfield-Hayes at the Vatican.
An Easter Monday in the Vatican that no one could have anticipated. Pilgrims flocking to the Vatican to be greeted by the news of the death of a pope. Just after 10 had come this shocking announcement.
At
7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his Church. He taught us to live the values of the Gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially toward the poorest and most marginalised.
Across Rome, the bells of every church began to ring out. A solemn salute and a message to the people of Rome that the Pope had died. In St Peter's Square, the news spread fast, bringing shock and sadness.
I was sort of really shocked because I was here yesterday at Mass and I saw the Pope and he looked just so fragile, you know.
Also sad considering that he's been a very energetic Pope. I have really appreciated the reforms that he has brought into the Church, his leadership style, the synodal leadership style. I think he's been a great Pope.
It's a great disappointment, a great loss. A man who has innovated the Church and a man who has left a great mark. And this, his absence, causes great pain.
You can see that when we ask people here what Pope Francis meant to them, you hear the same words coming up over and over. They speak of his humanity, of his warmth, and of his moral leadership. Wherever he went around the world, he was greeted with tremendous enthusiasm, just as he was here in St Peter's Square yesterday, in his very last public appearance. On Sunday morning, a clearly frail Pope Francis had greeted cheering crowds of Easter worshippers from the balcony of St Peter's. In a very thin voice, he gave this final Easter greeting.
Buona Pasqua.
It has now been confirmed he died after suffering a stroke and heart failure. Only weeks before, he had been discharged from hospital after suffering double pneumonia. It's clear Pope Francis was determined to be in St Peter's Square to celebrate Easter yesterday. But as he was driven around in his Pope-mobile, he looked frail and exhausted. Tonight, the Pope's official residence was sealed. Outside, thousands gathered to pray for him. Soon they will be joined by the great and the good from across the world to attend his funeral, including, we are told, President Donald Trump. But for those here, there is simply gratitude for the man he was and the job he did in leading their church. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, BBC News, in Rome.
Well, our religion editor, Aleem Maqbool, is at the Vatican. And Aleem, you've been talking to some of the people who've gathered there this evening, and we've also been learning more details tonight about the Pope's last wishes.
Yes, of course, thousands of people streamed into St Peter's Square during the day. They knew, of course, he was elderly. They knew, of course, that he had a very complex health picture. But the reason a lot of them are feeling so much shock is because They saw him just yesterday among them and seemingly getting better. Well, now we know that he suffered a stroke and a heart attack. But a lot of those people now feel privileged to have seen him for the final time in a public event like the Mass yesterday, and feel privileged to be a part of all of this. And yes, the Pope, we now know, left final words, a final testament to be read out, and it was published this evening. In it, he talks about the way he wanted to be buried, very simply, with a tombstone that just says his name, Francis, in a church, not St Peter's Basilica behind me. But part of his message was also to some of those who've been here and who've been praying for him today, and this is how he ended that testament. He said, "May the Lord grant a fitting reward to all those who've loved me and who continue to pray for me. The suffering that has marked the final part of my life, I offer to the Lord, for peace in the world and for fraternity among peoples." And that message at the end is very much in keeping with one of the legacies of Pope Francis' papacy. Yes, he spoke out for the marginalised, but he was also vehemently anti-war. I've been taking a look at Pope Francis' life and his hugely consequential papacy. His surprise election in 2013 would mark a more radical break with the past than many expected. Jorge Bergoglio did have Italian roots, but was born in Argentina. While studying for priesthood, he worked briefly as a nightclub bouncer. As Pope, he greeted his flock, having taken the name of a saint who championed the cause of the poor. His style was informal, even when conducting ceremonies, and his first act as Pope was to pay his own hotel bill. In his early gestures, like washing the feet of the elderly and prisoners, he showed desire for his priests to be closer to the disadvantaged. He spoke out for the protection of migrants and refugees, laying a wreath on the waters where so many died on their perilous journeys. He linked economic inequality to the environment. In a video launching a papal encyclical, he said climate change amounted to rich countries inflicting damage on poor ones. He travelled widely, drawing energy from the crowds. In Brazil, 3 million gathered on Copacabana Beach.
The Pope of the Holy See!
In 2015, he became the first Pope to address the US Congress.
I am most grateful for your invitation,
telling the world's richest nation to take care of Mother Earth.
God bless America.
He apologised for the scandal of sexual abuse of children by priests. His words here spoken by a translator.
God weeps for the sexual abuse of children.
On a visit to Ireland, the first by a pope in almost 40 years, he apologised to victims at almost every event, but scandals continued to emerge. His papacy marked something of a change of tone on the subject of homosexuality, early on remarking, "Who am I to judge?" when talking about a gay bishop. But some progressives argue that in practical terms, the Vatican's stance and the Church's teachings have changed little. Even so, conservative Catholics viewed him with suspicion. But in some ways, he was as traditional as Pope John Paul II, whom he made a saint. And he had very conservative views on abortion, contraception, surrogacy, and gender reassignment. His style of papacy, though, couldn't have been more different to his immediate predecessor, Benedict XVI, whose funeral he presided over. Through the scores of cardinals from the developing world he appointed, he changed the complexion of the church hierarchy, consolidating a shift in the centre of gravity of Catholicism away from Europe, where it was in decline, toward Latin America, Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. In recent years, Pope Francis was beset by health issues, most noticeably affecting his mobility, but he found it hard to pare down his busy schedule.
Buona domenica a tutti.
He was, above all, a pastoral pope, a man of humility who preferred the fellowship of ordinary believers to the trappings of ecclesiastical status and power.
Aline Maboul. Throughout the day, tributes have been paid from all around the world. King Charles, one of the last people to meet the Pope during a visit to Rome 2 weeks ago, said His Holiness will be remembered for his compassion, his concern for the unity of the Church, and for his tireless commitment to the common causes of all people of faith. The flag above Buckingham Palace has been lowered to half-mast. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, said Pope Francis was a pope for the poor, the downtrodden, and the forgotten. He never lost hope for a better world. In the US, President Trump ordered flags at the White House and on government buildings to be lowered. He paid tribute to the Pope during an Easter egg hunt in Washington, appearing on a balcony with his wife and a giant rabbit.
He was a good man, worked hard. He loved the world, and it's an honor to do that.
President Macron spoke of the pain felt by many.
Des plus vulnérables, des plus fragiles.
He's been at the side of the most vulnerable and fragile, with a great deal of humility and a very special sense of humanity in these times of war and brutality.
Thousands of Catholics across the world have been attending special church masses to mark the death of the Pope. Our World News correspondent Joe Inwood reports.
In Buenos Aires, Catholics have lost more than just their spiritual leader. Some have lost a man they considered a friend. Maria says she met Pope Francis at a moment of greatest need.
Today feels like a day of mourning. To me, Pope Francis became family from the moment I met him. All I ask now is that he may rest in peace.
News of Pope Francis's death broke overnight in his native Argentina, but within hours, Mass was being held at the cathedral he once presided over.
I believe he made a great effort to make it to Easter, which is the great celebration for Christians. What gives Christianity its meaning is the resurrection.
That was a message repeated at special services held all around the world. In the Philippines, home to one of the world's biggest Catholic populations, his humility was a source of inspiration.
When he became Pope, we are all awed by how humble he was, and he continued humble throughout his ministry.
He was the first Pope to have come from the Southern Hemisphere, the first non-European for hundreds of years. In India, they celebrated the life of a man who preached poverty and practiced what he preached. In Nigeria, it was a moment for celebration as much as sorrow.
We say thanks be to God because dying during the moments of the resurrection of Jesus gives on a good feeling that he has, as the apostles were asked to go to meet Jesus in Galilee, he has been asked to come home to meet Jesus.
While in New York, his life was described with the words of St. Paul.
I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I kept the faith. Boy, did he. He really fought the good fight.
Grant that your departed servant Pope Francis...
At Westminster Cathedral, a Requiem Mass celebrated the life of Pope Francis. Around the UK, special services were held. The Bishop of Armagh led prayers at St Patrick's Roman Catholic Cathedral. People arrived throughout the day in Cardiff to pay their respects. And in Scotland, people gathered at St Andrew's Cathedral in Glasgow. For the world's Catholics, it has been a day of sorrow, but also of appreciation for the life of a pope unlike any other. Joe Inwood, BBC News.
Well, this is what will happen over the next few days as Catholics around the world say farewell to the Pope. Tonight, Pope Francis's body rests in a chapel at his St Martha residence. He will be moved to St Peter's Basilica to lie in state as early as Wednesday. The Pope's funeral is traditionally held within 4 to 6 days of his death, with the funeral mass taking place in St Peter's Square. Pope Francis's death has now set in motion the conclave, which is the political process for the Church to select a new leader. The vote, which is held in the Sistine Chapel, usually takes place 15 to 20 days after the Pope's death. Mark Easton reports.
Pope Francis believed the Catholic Church should be a universal home where everyone was welcome. That was one of the messages from the priests at Westminster Cathedral this afternoon, where worshippers came to pray for a man who hoped to simplify the philosophy of his church.
So one of his quotes that I remember was, "If you want to know how successful your economy is, ask an unemployed person." He wanted us to look at things, as it were, from the outside in and not from the inside out. And in that sense, his desire to uphold and promote the cause of those on the margins was also a critique.
The Pope's office and apartments have been sealed. The papal fisherman's ring has been removed from Pope Francis's finger and smashed with a hammer. His body, dressed in red robes, will lie in state for 3 days. Ritual dictates almost every detail of a pope's death. But Pope Francis was a man with his own ideas. He has elected not to be buried in the Vatican, like most of his predecessors, but in the Basilica of St Mary Major, where he often chose to pray. It is in one of Rome's less glamorous neighbourhoods, Esquilino, home to budget hotels and modest B&Bs, close to the main bus and railway stations, the district where many immigrants have put down roots. Unlike the grand and traditional papal funeral afforded to Pope Benedict in 2023, Francis has designed a much humbler service. Rather than the grand 3-layered papal coffin, his will be a simple wooden casket. The funeral will take place within a week, amid 9 days of official mourning. Almost 80% of the cardinals who will elect Pope Francis's successor were chosen by him. His appointments have ensured it's a much less European constituency than before, with 18 South American and 18 African cardinals. The name that prompts the white smoke announcing the conclave has chosen the new Supreme Pontiff. May well be a surprise.
He's not followed the tradition of major cities automatically having a cardinal at their head, but he's chosen auxiliary bishops, he's chosen a man he met once in Russia. He's just made his picks, and that will remain, I'm sure.
Pope Francis will almost certainly have prayed that his vision for Catholicism might survive his death. A church less Roman and more Catholic, less focused on Europe and more on its global, diverse congregation.
We commend to God the soul of our beloved Pope Francis.
But for the 7 million Catholics in the UK, this is a time to mourn and to pray. The intrigues of the conclave are for another day. Mark Easton, BBC News.
Let's go back now to Aline McBride in Vatican City and tell us more about what is happening in the next few days.
Well, as we've heard, it'll be a laying in state in a couple of days' time, the funeral later in the week, and then in a couple of weeks' time, as we heard there, the conclave, and Pope Francis' influence is all over that. For the first time, it'll be a conclave of where more than half of the cardinal electors, as they're called, are non-Europeans. But of course his legacy is much more than that. That's why a lot of the tributes pouring in from every corner of the world are not just from sovereigns or heads of state. They're from people who felt that he spoke for them, the marginalised, and from people of all faiths and none as well.